get to the formal program and our distinguished speakers, I'm very 19th U.S. Secretary of Transportation. Prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, Secretary Buttigieg served 2 terms as mayor of his hometown in South Bend, Indiana. A graduate of Harvard University and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, Secretary Buttigieg served for 7 years as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, taking a leave of absence from the mayor's office for a deployment to Afghanistan in 2014. Time prevents a full accounting of his many accomplishments, so I will simply say welcome. We are so pleased you could join us for this fireside chat, Mr. Secretary.
Karen, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thrilled to be reconnected with the Commonwealth Club, which I've so enjoyed addressing, and very honored to be in the virtual company of Secretary Mineta, somebody whose public service is also something that time would prevent us fully acknowledging even now, but who has opened doors for so many, who has been very kind to me in introducing me to this position, following in his footsteps, and whose record of service in uniform and in public leadership really is inspiring. So honored to be associated with that name, and appreciate the chance to speak with the experts and attendees here who are so interested in some of the most important questions before us right now. I'll speak for just a few very brief moments and then look forward to a brief exchange as well. But the main thing I want to convey is the importance of vehicle electrification to meeting the president's goals for our climate. This administration views climate change as a defining challenge in our time. It's why at the April Climate Summit hosted at the White House, the president laid out the ambitious target to cut U.S. carbon emissions in half by 2030, in addition to re-establishing U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Accord. And the scale that we need in order to actually make that real is why the president's jobs plan is so important, especially when it comes to electric vehicles. Now, I believe the industry is moving there already. I believe adoption around the world is happening already. So some would ask why push on this if this is where things are headed. And I think the reason has to do with answering 3 questions. First of all, if electric vehicles are the future, will they be made in America? Will America be leading these markets? Will there be American workers and American firms on American soil making EVs? And I think that largely depends on our policy choices. Secondly, are they going to be affordable and accessible to all Americans, especially those who are less wealthy and those who live in rural areas, which, for reasons I'll go into in a minute, are among those who stand the most to gain, but not if they can't afford it in the first place. And third, maybe most importantly, okay, an EV transition may be ahead, but will it happen fast enough to beat climate change before it's too late? And so much on that depends on the choices we make. So let me unpack each of those very briefly. First of all, making the cars of the future in America. This is why the president's plan focuses on every part of that. Domestic supply chains, retooling factories to build components, funding manufacturers for training programs, helping Americans get the skills to build batteries and other parts of electric vehicles, as well as assembling the vehicles themselves, and creating all of the jobs that come with that. And by the way, a lot of these jobs are not newfangled, futuristic, mysterious jobs. This is the auto workers who will make cars. It is the electrical workers who will install the charger base that we need to support those cars. This is, in other words, very blue-collar vision for a greener America. And the plan incentivizes companies to manufacture their cars right here at home. Which brings me to the second point, which is making these electric vehicles more affordable and accessible. As mentioned earlier, the jobs plan envisions rebates and tax incentives for buyers of electric cars. And this is to make the upfront cost more attainable for more Americans, as well as the $15 billion we envision to build a network of 500,000 chargers across the country. Because there are some places where, even as we speak, you could easily make a profit on an electric vehicle charger. Others where it doesn't pencil out on its own, unless we make some policy choices. And often those are rural communities. Rural areas have been the last to be fully connected to any of the new advances in our country: electricity, telephones, broadband internet. And in each of those cases, good things happen when policy stepped in. That's something we need to do here. Rural residents actually, because they drive 66% more miles, just as a matter of common sense, burn more fuel and could save more money. I'm thinking about my in-laws in Michigan, a mom and pop landscaping company, and what my father and mother-in-law could save with an electric pickup truck. They could charge at home. They will have an electric truck that actually has better torque than the old gas truck, which is useful when my father-in-law is plowing snow in the winter, as well as when they're towing equipment. They won't have to worry about the distance if we get the charging network right. So every family that's thinking about their family budget stands to gain from this EV revolution, but only if we set the table in the right way. And time is of the essence. The climate crisis, the timelines, they're not established by Congress. They're not established by officials like me. They're established by physics, and they're bearing down on us. We can rise to meet this challenge and do it in time and be proud of our actions beginning in the early 2020s when it came to decarbonizing transportation, but only if we act now, only if we act big, which is why you see such energy and such boldness in the president's vision. So I appreciate the chance to share that quick outline with you, and look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you so much for those comments. They're very intriguing. And let's just jump right into the first question here. At a conceptual level, what's the appropriate role for the federal government in helping the U.S. transition towards electrification of the fleet? And what specific components of the American Jobs Plan will support that transition?
So I think the federal role really is to fill in the gaps. State government, local government, private sector, they're all playing a role. But it's clear that they shouldn't be asked to do it alone. The jobs plan includes $174 billion total to win the EV market. And the main elements of that include 15, as I mentioned earlier, to develop this national charging network. This would be a formula program to strategically deploy the EV charging infrastructure as well as potentially other alternative fuel sources along designated fuel corridors that we're already identifying in partnership with the Department of Energy, so that it's very clear where that national network is, and so that range anxiety doesn't stop adoption. And then, as I mentioned earlier, those consumer rebates and tax incentives. Now, we also have to recognize it's not just private vehicles, right? We are as the federal government, we're a huge purchaser of vehicles. So electrifying the federal fleet, the postal service, school buses. The jobs plan has the funds to electrify at least 20% of the yellow bus fleet. 40% of transit vehicles, which is obviously a big part of the solution. Mm-hmm. And even as we work toward getting the jobs plan passed, we're working this into what we're doing right now. So for the first time, have defined in new ways climate as a criterion in our existing grant program, both to send a message and to make real improvements and help communities that are doing it. So the federal government's not going to own and operate every charger. We're certainly not going to design, develop, and sell electric vehicles, but we do have a very important role. And the jobs plan is part of how we step up to that role.
Absolutely. Thank you. And in that response, you touched on equity. So I'm curious, how can the federal government ensure the benefits from electrification, whether cleaner air or well-paying new jobs, are dispersed equitably to communities across our entire nation, whether rural or urban?
So the truth is that our transportation policy has a mixed legacy in this country from an equity perspective. But now's a chance to do something about it. It's why the jobs plan includes a Justice 40 initiative. We call it Justice 40 because it envisions 40% of the overall benefits of the federal investments around things like climate going to disadvantaged communities that have been overburdened or underserved because of federal policy. It's a chance to make right what was broken in the past. You also consider the fact that often it is communities of color and low-income communities that are more likely to live near ports or highways where there is more particulate matter coming from tailpipe emissions and therefore higher rates of susceptibility to things like asthma. There's a health equity issue baked into our climate equity issue, all of which is a transportation equity issue. So this needs to be envisioned in all of our work, specifically funded in the President's Jobs Plan vision, but also just contemplated in the ways that we're working with states, with cities, with communities, notably with tribes. And as your question mentioned, this is about racial equity, but also regional equity and making sure we support urban and rural communities alike. Rural communities may struggle with EV adoption in terms of range, but they're actually better off in terms of charging access because most houses stand alone. You can plug it in your garage. Urban environments, it's the opposite. You're not as worried about range, but not everybody has a house with its own plug points. And that's why we need to think about how to make shared or publicly accessible charging stations more available in cities. All of this adds up into a picture where every American is better off because we're doing this and because we're doing it now.
Absolutely. And you touched on the importance of having well-paying jobs, family-supporting jobs. And to what extent will moving the nation, will we face moving towards an electric vehicle, excuse me, to what extent will moving the nation towards electric vehicles create those quality jobs, those well-paying jobs that can support our families?
Yeah, I think this is where we get to prove the falsehood of the old framework of climate versus jobs. This is about job creation through climate action. And that's why whenever you hear the president talk about climate, he's also talking about jobs. This is a great example of how to do it. It's why the jobs plan calls for investments connected to things like local hire, community workforce, project labor agreements, registered apprenticeships, because we also need to get people into these jobs who haven't had a shot at it in the past. I applaud those organized labor unions, for example, that have been proactive about welcoming in those who have not had the historical expectation of seeing people who look like them on work sites. We got to get this right. And that's part of what we can do in this electric vehicle revolution.
So true. And you remind me that if you can't see it, you can't be it, and how critically important it is that we engage that K through 12 sector also in this conversation about futures in transportation. I know we're down to our last couple minutes together, so I have one final question. What are the key barriers the nation will face in moving towards this electric vehicle fleet?
So a lot of it's technical, supply chains, electrical grid infrastructure. A lot of it's financial, making sure we're actually willing to make the investments, those market-making investments that catapult the electric vehicle adoption faster than it's been. But actually, I think a lot of it's cultural. We just need to realize that part of our tradition has always been innovation. And so in an odd way, nothing could be truer to our tradition, the same tradition that produced internal combustion engine vehicles that defined my city until the collapse of the Studebaker car company in the 60s. And then that collapse defined my city, and our recovery from it defines the life of my hometown to this day. We need to realize the relationship between past, present, and future, and acknowledge that nothing could be more American than finding a way to lead the world on the cars of the future, just as we did on the cars of the past.
Absolutely. What a pleasure it has been to be with you today. Thank you for making the time. Thank you for sharing your incredible comments, and we wish you well, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you. Thanks for this conversation, and thanks again for the expertise and the passion of everybody participating in this event. These kinds of problem solvers are going to create incredible results, and I think we'll look back and be proud of the 2020s if we get off to the right beginning right now.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Be well.